Bandich. Karen Simmons walked toward the boarding gate, a polite smile on her face, but her eyes carried a different message, one of quiet scrutiny. She had been doing this job for nearly 15 years, long enough to recognize who truly belonged in first class and who was just out of place. And then a family stepped forward. Ethan Carter, a tall man with a confident posture, held his wife's hand. Olivia, a woman of quiet elegance, her sharp eyes taking in everything around her. Their two children, neatly dressed, held onto their mother's hand, their eyes sparkling with excitement as they prepared to board the plane. Karen raised an eyebrow. A black family in first class? She let her gaze sweep over their attire, well put together, elegant but not flashy. Not the kind of passengers she was used to seeing in this section. She slowly scanned their tickets, then hesitated for a brief moment, glancing up at them again. First class? A slight discomfort rose within her, but she maintained her professional smile. She double-checked the system, even though there was no mistake, then nodded slightly. "I'm sorry, but it looks like there's been a mix-up with your reservation. I need to verify something in the system. Would you mind waiting just a moment?" Olivia's brow furrowed slightly, but her tone remained composed. "We have first-class tickets. Is there a problem?" Karen smiled again, this time with a sharper edge. "I just need to confirm. Standard procedure." She stepped aside, speaking in hushed tones with a colleague before returning. Taking a measured breath, she delivered the words calmly, yet with deliberate intent. "I'm sorry, but due to some last-minute seat adjustments, we'll have to move your seats to the back of first class. I appreciate your understanding." Ethan held her gaze, silent for a few seconds. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around his hand. The air between them thickened, not with confrontation, but with something far heavier. Finally, Ethan gave a small nod and quietly pulled his family's luggage aside. They didn't argue, they didn't protest, but the way Ethan looked at her, that lingering gaze, felt unsettling. Karen exhaled, satisfied that she had handled the situation. But what she didn't know was that in just a few hours, her entire world was about to turn upside down. Karen's silent victory, or so she thought. Karen stood upright, her eyes scanning first class with quiet satisfaction. She had done this job long enough to know how to maintain the standard of premium service. To her, first class wasn't just about extra legroom and expensive wine, it was about who truly belonged there. But as her gaze swept toward the last row of first class, where the Carter family now sat, an unfamiliar discomfort crept into her chest. They weren't flustered. They weren't angry. There was no reaction that she had expected from passengers being demoted to a lesser priority. Ethan Carter sat with perfect composure, his arm resting casually on the armrest, his expression devoid of resentment or frustration. Olivia Carter, sitting beside him, gracefully pulled out a book and began reading. Their two children sat quietly, not whining, not complaining. The control Karen thought she had suddenly felt fragile, and she didn't like that. Lisa's doubts? A young flight attendant questions what she saw. Lisa, a younger flight attendant still learning the ropes, turned to Karen as they stood near the service area. Her voice was quiet but held a trace of uncertainty. "Karen, what was that about? They had valid first-class tickets, didn't they?" Karen arched a brow, giving Lisa the kind of look a seasoned professional gives a naive rookie. "Lisa, you've got a lot to learn." Lowering her voice, as if revealing a trade secret, she added, "First class isn't just about a ticket, it's about the experience. And trust me, some people just don't fit that experience." Lisa pressed her lips together, glancing over at the Carter family, then back at Karen. "But if they paid for their seats?" Karen sighed, as if patiently explaining something obvious. "Do you really think anyone can just buy a first-class ticket?" She shook her head. "Sometimes people get free upgrades, sometimes they use points, and sometimes some agent somewhere just made a mistake. I'm just making sure this cabin maintains the standard it's meant to have." Lisa furrowed her brows, her discomfort evident. She didn't argue further. After all, Karen had been in this business much longer than she had. But something about the way Karen handled it didn't sit right. Ethan Carter turned a page in his book, though he wasn't reading a single word. He could feel Karen's eyes on them. And so could Olivia. She lowered her book slightly, stealing a glance at her husband, then offered a soft, knowing smile. She doesn't understand why we're so calm. Ethan chuckled under his breath. She will soon. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. And that makes her nervous. Olivia nodded. She had encountered people like Karen before, in high-end hotels, in luxury restaurants, and now on this very flight. People who believed they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. But Olivia knew better. She gently pulled the blanket over her sleeping daughter and continued observing. Silent, patient, but aware. Elsewhere in first class, another keen observer was paying close attention. Henry Wallace. A seasoned businessman who had flown first class more times than he could count, Henry knew the difference between exemplary service and subtle discrimination. And tonight, he had witnessed it all. The way Karen had scrutinized the Carter family's boarding passes longer than necessary. The way she had escorted them to the worst seats in first class. The way she had deliberately delayed their service while other passengers were served champagne within seconds. Henry swirled the amber liquid in his glass, deep in thought. What Karen didn't know was that he wasn't just another first-class passenger. His gaze drifted toward the Carter family, studying them carefully. Karen, meanwhile, continued about her duties, blissfully unaware that judgment had already begun. A passenger in the row ahead signaled for a drink. Karen flashed a warm smile, quickly pouring a generous glass of wine. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked sweetly. But when Ethan pressed the call button for a simple glass of water, Karen hesitated. She saw the light indicating his request and ignored it. She waited. Then, finally, after a deliberate pause, she made her way over, her voice polite but distant. "Yes, can I help you?" Ethan showed no reaction to the delay. He simply said, "Just a glass of water, please." Karen nodded briskly and walked away. But instead of bringing it right away, she stalled in the galley, letting the minutes stretch out unnecessarily. Lisa, standing nearby, noticed everything. "A glass of water shouldn't take this long." She turned to Karen. "I can take it to them." Karen's expression hardened. "No need, I'll handle it." Her tone was even, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Lisa hesitated, sensing something off, but she stepped back, unsure of what else to say. Finally, Karen took the glass of water and walked slowly toward the last row of first class. She set it down with a practiced smile. "Apologies for the wait, we've been quite busy." Ethan glanced at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "No problem." His response was simple, but his eyes saw through her. Karen clenched her jaw and turned away. She had barely taken a step when a voice, calm yet firm, broke through the air. "Excuse me, miss?" Karen froze. She quickly composed herself, turning around with her usual professional expression. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" Henry set his whiskey glass down, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. His gaze, sharp, knowing, locked onto hers. "Is there a particular reason the family in the last row of first class had to wait so long for service?" Karen's breath caught for just a fraction of a second. She could feel the weight of other passengers' gazes shifting toward them. Her lips parted, but for the first time that evening, she wasn't sure what to say. The control she thought she had, it was slipping through her fingers. Karen took a sharp breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "I assure you, sir, there's no discrimination here." Henry leaned back in his seat, arching an eyebrow. "Good. I'd hope not." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried enough weight for other passengers to hear. A few people glanced toward Karen, then at the Carter family. The atmosphere shifted. Karen could feel the heat rising in her face, but she refused to let this shake her composure. She gave a quick nod, a rehearsed smile, and walked away. But as she did, her fingers curled into a tight fist, her nails digging into her palm. Something was changing. From the service station, Lisa watched everything unfold. She saw the tension in Karen's posture. She saw how Henry Wallace wasn't going to let this slide. And more importantly, she saw how the Carter family reacted. No complaints, no demands for an apology, no visible anger. They were just watching. Waiting. Lisa didn't know who they were. But something about them made her feel that they weren't just any ordinary passengers. And maybe, just maybe, Karen had just made a serious mistake. Karen feels the unease. Karen walked briskly back to the galley, her heart pounding faster than it should. She tried to reassure herself. It's nothing, just a nosy passenger. But then why did she feel so uneasy? Henry Wallace wasn't just any passenger. He had influence, he had power. And if he decided to dig deeper into this situation, Karen swallowed hard, pushing down the rising anxiety. But the truth was, she had already lost control. And she had no idea that the people she had dismissed so easily could determine her future in an instant. Karen thought she had handled everything. She thought she was still in control. But the pieces on the chessboard were already moving. The Carter family remained patient. Henry Wallace continued watching. Lisa's doubts grew stronger. And the tension in first class was slowly, quietly, tightening its grip. Karen still believed she could manage the situation. But in reality, she was just a pawn in a much bigger game. Karen strode into the galley, the unease clinging to her like a shadow. She didn't understand why this was bothering her so much. They're just an ordinary family. Nothing special. But there was something about them, about the way they remained calm, about the way they observed, that she couldn't shake. She glanced at the clock. A few more hours until landing in Paris. All she had to do was get through the rest of the flight, ignore the suspicious looks, and soon this would all be over. But what she didn't know was that this wasn't ending. It was just beginning. In the last row of first class, Ethan Carter set his phone down after reading an email. He turned to his wife, his voice even, but with something hidden beneath the surface. Everything is in place. Olivia gave a knowing nod. She didn't ask questions. They had prepared for this from the start. This wasn't the first time, but this time, it would be different. Olivia's gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin, where Karen continued moving between the rows, flashing that same professional smile to the passengers she deemed worthy. But Olivia knew the truth. In just a few hours, Karen was going to realize that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. A secret conversation in the cockpit. Up in the cockpit, Captain David Parker sat at the controls, performing his routine system checks when an urgent internal call flashed across the screen. He pressed the button to answer, his voice steady. Captain Parker speaking. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but carried a weight that sent a chill down his spine. We have an important update. There are two very special passengers on board, Ethan and Olivia Carter. They are not just VIP guests. They are the new owners of Skylux Airlines. This is their first flight conducting an anonymous service evaluation. Captain Parker sat up straight, eyes widening. Owners? His heartbeat ticked up a notch as he quickly replayed the events of the flight. He had noticed them, a seemingly ordinary family with an unmistakable air of quiet authority. And if they were truly the new heads of the airline, then anyone who had treated them unfairly on this flight was in serious trouble. He swallowed hard, fully grasping the gravity of the situation. Someone was about to pay the price. Henry Wallace, the watchful eye. Meanwhile, Henry Wallace had not stopped observing. From the moment he boarded, he had seen flight attendants who exemplified professionalism and grace. But Karen? Karen was different. Her bias wasn't overt, but it was woven into every small action. The way she delayed serving the Carter family, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she subtly tried to make them feel like they didn't belong. Henry took another sip of his whiskey, his expression darkening as he watched Karen once again ignore the last row of first class. She's going to regret this. Henry wasn't the type to meddle in other people's business, but he was a major shareholder in Skylux Airlines, and if there was one thing he couldn't tolerate, it was incompetence that damaged the reputation of the airline. He had seen enough. It was time to act. Lisa senses something bigger at play. Back in the service area, Lisa felt a growing unease. She watched Karen moving through the cabin, but her confidence was gone. Whatever Henry Wallace had said earlier had clearly rattled her. Lisa didn't know exactly what was happening, but her instincts told her something far bigger was unfolding. She glanced toward the Carter family. They were still calm. Too calm. It was as if they already knew something the rest of them didn't. Karen feels the pressure mounting. Karen tried to shake off the feeling creeping into her chest. She focused on serving the other passengers, forcing herself to ignore the whispering doubts in her head. But as she passed the last row, Ethan's gaze met hers. A look that wasn't angry, wasn't resentful, just knowing. Karen's stomach twisted. Why weren't they upset? Why weren't they complaining? And why, at this moment, did it feel like she was the one at a disadvantage? She took a sharp breath, shaking her head slightly. There's nothing going on. They're just an ordinary family. But just as she turned back to the service area, a fellow flight attendant approached her, voice low but tense. Karen, the captain wants to see you, immediately. Karen froze in place, a truth about to be unveiled. Karen turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Something was about to be revealed. She didn't know it yet, but in a matter of minutes, her entire world was about to change. Karen had believed she was in control, but the truth was, she never had control of anything. The summon that changed everything. Her body tensed at the words. The captain wants to see you. Immediately. The phrase echoed in her head like an alarm bell. Why? Why would the captain want to see her? Karen quickly composed her expression, forcing herself to appear calm. But the way her fingers clenched around the edge of her apron betrayed her. She was nervous. As she walked past the rows of seats, she could feel the weight of passengers' stares. She stole a quick glance at Henry Wallace. He was still seated, whiskey glass in hand, watching her with an unreadable expression. Karen swallowed hard. She had no idea what he had said, but she knew one thing for certain. This flight was no longer under her control. Inside the cockpit, a moment of judgment. Captain David Parker sat upright, his gaze sharp, his demeanor that of a man ready to pass judgment. Beside him stood James Carter, a senior exec from Skylux Airlines. His posture was stiff, professional, and in his hands was a folder. Karen stepped inside, the cockpit door shut behind her. The air felt heavier. She took a breath, trying to maintain her composure. "Captain, how can I help?" Parker folded his arms across his chest and nodded toward James. "Mr. Carter will explain why you're here." Karen turned to James, her face neutral, but her pulse hammering. James opened the folder, his voice steady but firm. "We've received reports about your service conduct on this flight." Karen frowned slightly. "Reports? I don't understand." James flipped to another page, his eyes never leaving her. "Multiple passengers have observed clear discrimination toward the Carter family, including deliberate delays in service, an unjustified seat reassignment, and other unprofessional behavior." A cold chill spread through Karen's body. She parted her lips to defend herself, but James continued before she could speak. "Before you say anything, there's something you need to understand. The Carter family isn't just another first-class passenger." He paused. Then, with an air of finality, he delivered the words that knocked the breath out of her. "They are the new owners of Skylux Airlines." The world stopped. Karen froze. For a moment, her mind went completely blank. Then a slow, creeping wave of icy panic flooded her chest, threatening to knock the air out of her lungs. Owners? No, that couldn't be true. They were just a family, an ordinary family. Nothing about them had suggested wealth or power, certainly not the kind that could own an entire airline. She turned back to James, searching for some hint that this was a cruel joke. But his stoic expression never wavered. She glanced toward Captain Parker, but his face was colder than she had ever seen. Then, the captain spoke, his tone unforgiving. "Do you have anything to say, Karen?" The cockpit. She didn't know exactly what was happening. But one thing was certain, Karen was no longer in control. Lisa's gaze shifted to the Carter family. They were still calm, still waiting. And for the first time, Lisa wondered if they had known this was coming all along. Ethan sat upright, his gaze fixed on the window, his movements unnervingly composed. Olivia sipped her water, turning the pages of her book as if this were just another ordinary day. But Lisa knew better. They had known this was coming, and now they were simply waiting to see how far Karen would take herself down. Karen inhaled sharply, trying to reclaim her professional composure. I had no idea. If I made an oversight in my service, I sincerely apologize." James studied her for a long moment before setting his folder down and crossing his arms. "The issue isn't what you didn't know. The issue is how you treated them when you thought they were just ordinary passengers." Karen held her breath. James continued, his voice steady but razor sharp. "They specifically chose this flight to assess the professionalism of our crew, and based on what we've observed, you have failed." A tremor ran through Karen's body. No, she had been with Skylux for 15 years. She couldn't lose everything over one mistake. She swallowed hard, scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. "I am committed to making this right. I will do whatever it takes to regain the company's trust." James didn't respond immediately. Then, after a pause, he picked up the intercom phone. "We'll let senior leadership make that decision." Karen felt the ground beneath her collapse. Karen walks out of the cockpit, but her world has changed. She walked out of the cockpit like a ghost, her mind blank. She had lost control. She had let her unconscious bias dictate her actions, and now the consequences were unavoidable. As she stepped past the galley, she could feel the weight of every gaze upon her. Lisa, Henry Wallace, and most of all, the Carter family. Ethan watched her, his expression devoid of anger, of satisfaction, just disappointment. And somehow that cut deeper than any reprimand ever could. Karen knew she had lost everything. The flight continues. But for Karen, everything has changed. There were no more forced smiles, no more illusion of authority. All that remained was fear of what was to come. She had no idea what awaited her when the plane landed. But one thing was certain. Her future was no longer in her hands. It was in the hands of the people she had dismissed so easily. And now they would decide whether she still had a place in Skylux Airlines. The walk of shame. As Karen stepped back into the cabin, it felt different. She had once moved through these aisles with confidence, knowing she held the authority in her domain. But now, every step felt heavier. She could feel eyes watching her. Henry Wallace sat in his seat, arms crossed, his gaze sharp, as if he had seen this coming from the very start. Lisa stood near the galley, her expression filled with a mixture of doubt and quiet realization. And at the back of first class, the Carter family remained still, watching, waiting. Ethan wasn't searching for answers anymore. His gaze had shifted. It was no longer questioning. It was confirmation. Karen clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't let this destroy her. She had been a flight attendant for 15 years. She couldn't lose it all over what she believed was a misunderstanding. She took a deep breath and returned to her duties, pretending as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew. Something had. A critical call in the cockpit. Inside the cockpit, a crucial conversation was unfolding. Captain Parker held the internal phone to his ear, his face unreadable as he spoke with Skylux Airlines senior leadership. The voice on the other end was slow, deliberate, and unyielding. "We will handle this as soon as the plane lands." Parker nodded, setting the phone down. He cast a glance at James Carter, who stood beside him. Unshaken, unmoved. James took a slow sip of water, then spoke in a measured tone. "She doesn't realize it's already over." Parker gave a knowing nod. Karen tries to hold herself together, but she knows. Karen could feel the weight pressing down on her. Every time she passed the Carter family, an invisible tension wrapped around her like a noose. No one needed to say a word. Their silence said everything. Lisa hesitated before stepping closer, her voice low, cautious. "Karen, what's going on?" Karen turned to her, her eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Nothing, but Lisa didn't believe that. She had worked with Karen long enough to know Karen never worried about anything. But now, she was terrified. The plane prepares to land, and the tension reaches its peak. Karen went through the final checks before landing, but every action felt mechanical, detached. She was no longer the confident flight attendant she had once been. As she returned to the service area, Henry Wallace set his whiskey down. And then, in a voice calm but commanding, he called out, "Flight attendant." Karen froze. Slowly she turned, forcing a professional smile. "Yes, sir?" Henry narrowed his eyes, his tone low but powerful. "Do you understand the mistake you just made?" Karen swallowed hard. I'm not sure what you mean, sir." Henry raised an eyebrow before gently placing his glass back down. "That's the problem." Karen had no response. She could feel her control crumbling, piece by piece. The plane touches down, and Karen's nightmare begins. The wheels touch the runway, but to Karen it felt like her entire world was shaking. The flight was over. But her reckoning had only just begun. A colleague approached, their voice hesitant, almost reluctant. "Karen, senior leadership wants to see you as soon as we land." Karen froze. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had known this moment was coming. But now that it was here, she wasn't ready. She turned her head, but there was no one to save her. Lisa watched her with quiet concern, her face uneasy. Henry Wallace sipped his whiskey, his demeanor unbothered, as if he had seen this ending from the start. And the Carter family? They remained still, calm, unshaken. like nothing had ever happened. Ethan slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket and met Karen's gaze. No gloating, no anger, only the truth. The cabin doors swung open. Passengers began disembarking, filing out of first class. Karen stood near the exit, forcing herself to smile, nodding at each passenger as they left. She tried to act normal, but when Ethan and Olivia Carter stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan stopped, his eyes locked onto hers. For a moment it felt like time had frozen. Then he spoke. His voice was even, steady, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "Thank you for the flight attendant Simmons." Karen felt her entire body stiffen. No sarcasm, no anger, but the gravity of his words was suffocating. Olivia offered a polite nod, her expression unreadable. Then they walked away. Karen wanted to say something, to explain, to defend herself, but no words came out. Because there was nothing left to say. Minutes later, a flight attendant approached. "They're waiting for you in the VIP lounge." Karen took a shaky breath. Her feet felt like lead, but she forced herself forward. She knew she had no other choice. Her moment of reckoning had arrived. She had once believed she was in control of everything. But now, everything was beyond her control. Karen had once commanded authority on her flights, but now, she was no longer in charge. And she was about to pay the price for every decision she had made. She walked slowly through the airport hallway, each step heavier than the last. She had never realized how long the distance from the plane to the VIP lounge could feel. Every employee she passed glanced at her. Some whispered. The news was spreading. They knew. Karen inhaled deeply, trying to hold her head high, trying to grasp at any last shred of control. But the truth was, she had none left. She reached the VIP lounge doors. They slid open. Inside, Ethan and Olivia Carter sat in elegant leather chairs, poised, collected. They were no longer just first-class passengers. They were the owners of Skylux Airlines. Karen takes a seat. Tension fills the room. Karen stepped inside, and the door closed softly behind her. The silence was so thick, she could hear her own heartbeat. Ethan Carter studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Have a seat." Karen lowered herself into the chair, her fingers interlocking in her lap, as if holding herself together. Across from her, Olivia Carter leaned back in her seat. Her gaze was sharp, but there was no visible anger. She didn't need to be angry. Their silence was far more terrifying. Karen tried to steady her breath, but under the table, her hands trembled. The conversation begins. No more excuses. Ethan twirled a pen between his fingers, his voice calm but commanding. "We'd like to hear it from you. Why do you think we're sitting here right now?" Karen licked her lips, trying to maintain control. I assume it's about my service during the flight." Ethan set the pen down, slowly. "Not just about how you served us," he corrected. He let the words settle before continuing. "It's about how you treated people you didn't think belonged there." Karen's chest tightened. Olivia leaned forward, her voice smooth, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "Be honest, Karen. If we weren't the owners of Skylux Airlines, if you weren't sitting here right now, would you even think you did anything wrong?" Karen opened her mouth to defend herself, but the moment Olivia's gaze locked onto hers, she knew. She couldn't lie. Every excuse she had rehearsed in her mind felt empty. Finally, her shoulders sank. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I was wrong." Not just an apology, a truth exposed. Ethan nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "Wrong how?" Karen swallowed hard. They weren't looking for a generic apology. They wanted the truth. She inhaled deeply, staring at the table as if the answers were there. "I judged you, the moment I saw you." Her throat felt dry as she forced herself to continue. "I let the biases in my head dictate how I treated you." She clenched her hands together. "I thought I had the right to decide who belonged in first class and who didn't." The words left her chest feeling crushed, but they were the truth. For 15 years, she had worked believing she knew exactly who deserved the best treatment. But the truth, she had known nothing at all. Olivia speaks, a lesson she won't forget. Olivia crossed her arms, her eyes never leaving Karen's. "You're not the first person to underestimate us." Olivia's words were smooth, deliberate, yet sharp enough to slice through the silence. "We've encountered people like you before, many times." She held Karen's gaze, unwavering. "But every time, I ask myself, how many of them ever realize their mistake?" Karen's hands clenched tightly in her lap. She couldn't answer. because she knew Olivia was right. After a heavy silence, Ethan leaned back in his chair. He flipped open a folder on the table, scanning the contents before speaking. "We've given careful thought to what happened today." Turning a page, his gaze remained on the document as he continued. "And the truth is, what you did wasn't just a minor mistake." Karen felt her chest tighten. "The way you treated us, the way you treat any passenger you believe doesn't fit, isn't just a professional failure." Ethan closed the folder and finally looked at her. "It's a moral failure." Karen felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. She couldn't argue. She couldn't deny it. She could only sit there and face it. Olivia rose to her feet, adjusting her coat. She looked at Karen one last time. "We'll be forwarding this report to corporate leadership." She paused, her voice steady but piercing. "And regardless of what they decide, you need to ask yourself one thing." Karen lifted her eyes, confusion flickering in them. Olivia tilted her head, her gaze as sharp as a blade. "After 15 years in this job, what have you actually learned?" Karen had no answer. Her throat was dry, her mind empty. Ethan and Olivia left the room, leaving her alone with the weight of her own actions. The door closed softly behind them, and Karen knew this wasn't just about her job. This was about who she had become, and whether she was willing to change. Karen had been exposed. But was this the end? Would she lose everything? Or would she find a way to change? The flight had landed, but her journey had only just begun. The call that would seal her fate. The VIP lounge door closed behind her, leaving Karen alone in a silence more terrifying than any reprimand. She couldn't hear the bustling airport. She couldn't see the well-dressed passengers walking by. All that remained was emptiness. "After 15 years in this job, what have you actually learned?" Olivia's question echoed in her mind, repeating like an unrelenting nightmare, and she had no answer. The call from leadership, the final decision. Not even 15 minutes later, Karen's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Human Resources, Skylux Airlines. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. This was it. Her verdict. "Flight Attendant Simmons, we need you at Skylux headquarters within 24 hours to discuss your employment status." Karen's heart dropped. Discuss her employment? She had worked here for 15 years. No one got called in to discuss their job unless it was serious. She inhaled sharply, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I understand." But the truth was, she didn't understand anything at all. She didn't understand how, in just one flight, the career she had spent years building was crumbling right before her eyes. Returning home, a hollow feeling. Karen left the airport, her mind spinning with panic and disbelief. She had never felt so small. Driving home, she barely registered the roads, the stoplights, the turns. When she finally reached her small apartment, she shut the door with force, exhaling shakily as she collapsed onto the couch. She pulled off her shoes. Then, she unwrapped the navy blue silk scarf around her neck, the one she had once worn with pride. She stared at it for a moment, then tossed it onto the table. It was just fabric now. A meaningless piece of cloth. Karen looked around the quiet, empty space. For the first time, she realized she had never truly belonged here. 15 years of service. 15 years of believing she knew everything about the airline industry. And in one flight, all of it was gone. News spreads fast. Karen's reputation crumbles within an hour. News of what had happened on Flight 512 had spread across the company. The Skylux employee group chats were buzzing. "Did you hear? Karen Simmons might be fired." "No way. She's been at Skylux forever." Apparently, she treated the Carter family terribly without knowing they own the airline. If that's true, she's done for. Karen unlocked her phone, staring at the messages. They were talking about her. Not as a respected senior flight attendant, not as a mentor, not even as a person. She was a cautionary tale, a lesson in arrogance. She turned off her phone, but she couldn't turn off the fear that wrapped itself around her, tightening like a noose. A call from Lisa. One last chance? Her phone vibrated. "Lisa." Karen hesitated. Then she answered. "Are you okay?" Lisa's voice was soft, careful. Karen breathed in deeply, trying to sound normal. "I'm fine." But they both knew she was lying. Lisa was silent for a moment before she finally asked, "I don't want to assume anything, but if you had the chance to explain yourself, what would you say?" Karen closed her eyes, her throat tightening. She didn't know, because there was no explanation, no excuse, Everything that happened was because of her own choices. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice raw and hoarse. I don't know, Lisa. I really don't know. The next morning, arriving at Skylux Airlines headquarters, Karen barely slept. When she finally got out of bed, she moved on autopilot, slipping into her flight attendant uniform as if it still meant something. But when she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see a confident woman anymore. She saw someone who had lost everything. Walking into Skylux Airlines headquarters, Karen immediately felt the weight of every stare. Some people only glanced at her, others whispered. She didn't need to hear what they were saying. She already knew. They all knew. Taking a deep breath, she walked straight to the conference room, where her fate would be decided. As she stepped inside, Captain Parker, James Carter, and a representative from HR were already seated. The door clicked shut behind her. No turning back now. James Carter speaks. The final judgment. James Carter glanced at the documents in front of him before locking eyes with Karen. We have reviewed everything that took place on Flight 512. Karen held her breath. After careful evaluation, the leadership team has decided. The room felt like it had frozen in time. You are hereby terminated from Skylux Airlines, effective immediately. The words hit like a hammer. Karen sat paralyzed, fired. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing James Carter say it out loud, it didn't feel real. 15 years and it all ended like this. She opened her mouth wanting to say something, anything. But no words came out. All she could do was sit there and face the consequences she had created for herself. Karen's life has changed forever. No more Skylux Airlines, no more senior flight attendant title, no more respect she once thought she deserved. She had lost everything because of one wrong assumption. But the real question was this truly the end? Or was it the beginning of something else? Karen didn't know, but she did know one thing. She was no longer the person she had once believed herself to be. And now, she had to face that truth. Karen lost everything. But what happens next? Will she find a way to rise again? Or will she let this mistake destroy her future completely? The story isn't over, because sometimes losing everything is the real beginning. Karen stepped out of Skylux Airlines headquarters, feeling completely empty. 15 years, gone in just minutes. No more uniform, no more identity. Karen stepped out of Skylux Airlines headquarters, feeling an overwhelming sense of emptiness. No more uniform she once wore with pride. No more walking onto a plane, head held high, carrying the title of a senior flight attendant. Now, she was just another person, with an irreversible mistake. The chill of the afternoon breeze hit her face as she walked to the parking lot. She looked around. Everything was the same. The city still moved forward. People still went to work. Planes still took off. But she no longer knew where she belonged. Karen sat in the driver's seat, placing her hands on the wheel, but she didn't start the car. What was she supposed to do now? A part of her wanted to blame someone, the system, the circumstances, the unfairness of it all. But deep down she knew there was no one to blame but herself. And for the first time in her life, she had to face who she truly was. A chance to make it right? Her phone buzzed. Karen glanced at the screen. A message from Lisa. I don't know if you want to hear this, but I think this could be an opportunity for you. I just watched a program about awareness and equity training in the service industry. If you want to change, maybe this is where you start. Karen closed her eyes. A lump formed in her throat. An opportunity? After everything that had happened? Her fingers hovered over the screen, staring at the link Lisa had sent. Logic told her nothing could change the past, but her heart whispered, maybe there was still a way forward. She took a deep breath, hesitated for just a moment, and then she clicked the link. The moment Karen chose to change. No one can turn back time. But perhaps we can choose to move forward. This story isn't just about a flight attendant losing her job. It's about those small moments in life when we are forced to confront ourselves. We all make mistakes. We all let unconscious biases shape the way we treat others, sometimes without realizing it. But the question isn't how badly we've failed. It's what we do next. Remember this. You can always choose to change. What do you think about Karen's story? Have you ever been in a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to Aiva Stories so you never miss another powerful story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.